The summer sun clung to my skin like a silent accusation, heavy and unblinking as it pressed down on ridge. Heat boiled off the porch boards beneath my feet, bending the street into wavering ribbons of gold, and I remember thinking that even the wind seemed ashamed to touch me. Every gaze that drifted past the saloon felt like a whispered verdict. They saw the daughter of broken horse trader, loud drinker, man who played with ruin the way other men played with dice, and they decided I must be as lost as he was. I stood there with a washcloth in my hands, breath tight in my chest, wishing I could scrape the shame off my skin the way sweat rolled down my neck. The town judged my father by his failures and judged me by belonging to him, and that loneliness stung deeper than heat. Inside the saloon, the air was thicker, steeped in the mingled scents of stale whiskey, tired sweat, and the ghosts of men whose laughter had long since turned brittle. My father sat hunched over his usual corner table, head bowed, fingers trembling around a chipped mug he pretended held courage instead of liquor. When he looked up, I saw the remnants of the man he used to be, a horseman with steady hands and a proud back, but the softer years had been carved away by debts, droughts, and the grief he never spoke aloud. Sometimes I wondered whether he shaped his shame around himself like armor, or whether it was a burden he simply no longer had the strength to set down. The men who gathered near him did not come for companionship, they came to witness a spectacle. And I, by blood alone, was tethered to his downfall. Most days I tried to slip through town unnoticed, but Ridge had a way of watching everything. Women on porches paused their needlework when I passed, pretending their curiosity was concern. Men tipped their hats out of habit rather than kindness, their eyes cutting sideways as if measuring how far my father's ruin extended into me. Even the children, barefoot and dust-streaked, seemed to sense the fragile thread that held my world together. On that burning afternoon, when cicadas droned louder than reason itself, I stepped outside to fetch water from the pump and saw Thane riding down the road. The rancher sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared, as if the horizon itself leaned toward him with respect. He did not glance at me the way others did. His gaze held neither pity nor judgment, and that strange gentleness unsettled me more than cruelty ever had. Thane always carried a stillness with him, the kind that made noisy men quiet and weary hearts unclench for a breath. I had seen him only in passing, at the general store trading for canvas or salt, at the livery speaking softly to a skittish mare, at sundown riding back toward his ranch with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the world could not be rushed. People said he kept to himself because loss had taken its toll on him too, though no one knew the story well enough to claim truth. Yet whenever our paths crossed, he treated me as if I were invisible in the gentlest way, without starring, without avoiding, simply allowing me the dignity of being unremarkable. For a woman like me, accustomed to whispers curling behind her like dust trails, that quiet respect felt almost like mercy. But mercy could not soften the truth waiting inside the saloon that afternoon. When I returned with the bucket in hand, voices rose in a drunken roar. My father, red-faced and sweating, stood at the chess table he guarded like an altar. Chess was the one thing he had left, his single remaining claim to dignity, and he wielded it with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. Coins lay scattered across the board. Men circled him like hungry dogs. I sensed immediately that something was wrong. His stance was too unsteady, his breath too wild, and the gleam in his eyes held the reckless shine of a man seeking ruin because ruin was easier than remorse. When he noticed me in the doorway, his expression twisted, not with shame, but with a kind of blurred pride that terrified me more than anger. "Making a fool's wager," someone hollered, and the room burst into drunken laughter. My father slammed his palm against the table, sending pieces rattling. He boomed promises he couldn't keep, debts he couldn't pay, victories he couldn't win. The smell of whiskey clung to him so thickly it felt like another presence in the room, a mocking spirit perched on his shoulder. I felt eyes on me, sharp and gleaming, as though every man there sensed a storm gathering. Then the saloon door creaked and Thane stepped inside. The laughter died in pieces like embers losing their glow. My father's smile widened with dangerous eagerness. He gestured toward Thane with a sway that made my stomach turn, and in that instant I knew something terrible had already taken root in him, something I could not unmake. Thane's gaze swept the room once before settling on my father, then briefly on me. There was no alarm in his expression, only a quiet caution, as though he already sensed the edge my father was dancing upon. Before I could speak, before I could pull my father aside or beg him to stop, the words erupted from him with the force of a bruised and desperate pride. He announced a wager so vile the room seemed to tilt around me. He claimed he would stake his daughter, me, as the prize for any man bold enough to outplay him at the board. My breath vanished. The bucket slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor, water spreading like a wounded shadow across the boards. Gasps rose, followed by a hush so complete it pressed against my ears. Thane did not move, but something in his stillness shifted, like a fuse catching flame. I wanted to run to my father, to seize his arm and shake some shred of sense back into him, but my feet felt buried beneath the floorboards. Shame surged through me like heat lightning, bright and bruising, and every cruel whisper I had ever heard seemed to echo inside my skull. The men around the table eyed me with new hunger, as though my father's madness had peeled away whatever thin veneer of decency they possessed. My pulse thundered. The room spun. and still Thane said nothing. He stepped forward with the deliberate calm of a man walking toward a wildfire he refused to let spread. His eyes met mine for a single steady heartbeat, a look not of possession or pity but of warning, as though he stood between me and some unseen precipice. Then he turned to my father, voice low, almost gentle, asking what stakes a man must carry to gamble something he cannot bear to lose. The room held its breath, and I felt the world tip toward a moment I knew would change everything. For me, the room felt carved from silence after my father's wager, as though every breath had been stolen and pinned to the rafters. Men shifted their boots across the warped floorboards, their drunken amusement dissolving into sharpened curiosity. My father swayed beside the chess table, his fingers clutching the back of a chair to keep himself upright. His pride, swollen and poisonous, pushed through him with every ragged exhale. Thane stood across from him, still as a stone cut from the desert itself. In that hush, the only sound was the faint clatter of a pawn my father's shaking hand had knocked over. The moment stretched long enough for embarrassment to burn through me like wildfire. My father's careless boast had tossed me into the center of a circle of eyes hungry for spectacle, and all I could do was grip the edge of the doorway, willing myself not to crumble under the weight of humiliation. Thane didn't respond immediately, and that silence made the crowd lean in. When he did speak, his voice was low, steady, frightening in its restraint. He asked my father if he truly understood the bargain he offered, that a daughter was not a coin, not a debt, not a thing to wager away under the haze of liquor. My father laughed, a brittle sound cracking in his throat, insisting it was all in good fun. His words tumbled over each other in a slurry of bravado, but beneath them I sensed the truth he refused to face. He had lost too much, too often, and desperation had hollowed him out until he mistook recklessness for control. The men around him roared their approval, egging him on with slurred encouragement, because nothing stirred a crowd like the promise of another man's downfall. Thane's jaw tightened, not in anger but in something quieter, heavier. He stepped toward the table with a calm that sent a strange ripple through the saloon. His boots moved without hesitation, his gaze fixed on my father, not hostile, not accepting, but determined. I could see it in the way he held himself. He wasn't playing for the prize my father had offered, nor for the amusement of the crowd. There was something else guiding him, something I could feel like an invisible current tugging the room toward a different kind of storm. When he pulled out the chair opposite my father, the wooden legs scraped across the floor, a soft groan splitting the heavy silence. My father grinned as though victory had already been carved into the air, unaware that he stood at the edge of a moment that would haunt him long after the whiskey faded. The men pressed closer, forming a loose ring around the table. A murmur rippled through them, bets exchanged, whispers traded, assumptions made. I saw more than one man glance at me with crude satisfaction, as if my fate were entertainment rather than a violation of everything I had left to call my own. My hands trembled where they clutched my skirt, rage and shame and fear tightening inside my ribs until each breath felt sharp. Yet I remained in place, watching, unable to tear my gaze from the two men seated before the board. Thane adjusted a knight with deliberate precision. My father swirled the remnants of courage in his mug and declared the match begun. The opening moves clicked softly, each one echoing louder in the hollowness of my chest. Thane played with patience, moving pieces as though guided by an unseen map. He studied my father not with arrogance but with a deep, solemn understanding. My father lunged across the board with aggressive tactics, his movements brash, his confidence heightened by the drunken belief that he could not lose what he had no right to give. There were moments when he seemed to regain fragments of the man he once was, steady, clever, strategic, but the drink always caught up to him, clouding judgment, trembling his hands. I watched him lean too far forward, breathing hard, sweat trickling along his temple. The board became a battlefield between two men fighting for reasons neither would speak aloud. As the game unfolded, memories rose unbidden within me, my father teaching me the movement of each piece when I was a child, telling me strategy was nothing but foresight and mercy tangled together. I had admired him then before loss and liquor stripped the gentleness from him. Watching him now, I felt both pity and aching disappointment. He had wagered the only thing he had left that carried meaning, me. A daughter he had failed to protect, failed to cherish, failed to understand. That wound throbbed deeper than any humiliation the crowd could inflict. Thane rarely looked up from the board, but when he did, he met my gaze with a steadiness that unsettled me. There was no claim in his eyes, no triumph, no hunger for the prize my father boasted about. Instead, I saw a question, silent, gentle, urging me not to lose myself in my father's ruin. It was a look that anchored me when my knees weakened and fear clawed up my throat. I dropped my gaze quickly, unsure what to do with the unfamiliar warmth rising through the shame. The game tightened into a deadlock. My father's recklessness had backed him into a corner he refused to acknowledge. Thane maneuvered with quiet strategy, his restraint both merciful and unyielding. With each passing turn, the room grew hotter as though the summer heat had seeped into the wood, the walls, the skin of every man crowded inside. Even the dust hanging in the sunlight seemed to hold its breath. Then came the moment, soft, devastating, inevitable. Thane lifted his bishop, studied the board briefly, and positioned it with a calm finality that silenced the room. My father stared at the configuration as though seeing it for the first time. Then his face crumpled, pride collapsing beneath the weight of realization. Thane whispered the word almost gently, checkmate. The crowd erupted not with celebration but with gasps, mutters, and the uneasy shuffle of men who realized the entertainment had soured into cruelty. My father sagged back into his chair, breath ragged, eyes clouding with horror as he remembered what he had promised. He reached for his mug, hands trembling so fiercely he nearly dropped it. I stepped back, gripping the doorway as though it were the only solid thing left. Though Thane had won, he did not rise triumphantly. Instead, he stood slowly, his expression solemn, his gaze never once drifting toward me as though claiming what had been wagered. That restraint struck deeper than any declaration might have. My father tried to speak, apologies tangled with excuses, but the words stuck in his throat, drowned by the murmurs of the crowd. Before he could reach for me, I fled. I pushed through the saloon doors and stumbled into the scorching sunlight, breath shattering in my chest. The street swam before me in a haze of gold and humiliation. I pressed a hand to my eyes, tears burning hot as the dust swirling at my feet. Behind me, the saloon door creaked open. I heard boots on the porch, steady and slow, and I knew without turning that Thane was stepping into the sunlight after me. His silence followed me like a promise or a reckoning, changing the heat of the day into something unbearably bright. I didn't hear Thane at first. The sunlight was too loud, the heat too thick, and my humiliation too raw to let anything else exist beside it. I stood at the edge of the porch, trembling as if the whole town had carved its judgment into my skin. When his footsteps finally reached me, they came without urgency, a quiet presence instead of an intrusion. He stopped a respectful distance behind me, allowing the silence to settle like dust between us. For the first time in my life, a man who had every right to claim something refused even the slightest gesture of ownership. His restraint shook me more deeply than my father's recklessness. I wished I could disappear into the shimmering road before Thane saw how broken I felt. Yet something in the air told me running would only fracture the moment further. Thane spoke my name gently, the syllables low and steady as though he feared startling a wounded creature. I turned slowly, bracing myself for pity or patronizing comfort, but his expression held neither. He regarded me with a quiet grief that did not belong to him, as though he mourned the weight I carried long before stepping into the saloon. I couldn't hold his gaze, it felt too honest. My voice wavered as I told him I would not be part of a drunken bargain no matter who had won. He nodded, unoffended, and told me with calm certainty that he had no intention of claiming a woman offered like currency. His words struck something fragile inside me. I hated that my throat tightened, hated that relief came like a soft ache, hated that a stranger had protected my dignity more fiercely than the man who raised me. He stepped aside, letting sunlight shift between us. The gesture felt deliberate, an offering of space rather than distance. I tried to thank him, but gratitude tangled with shame in my chest. Thane didn't press me for words. Instead, he looked out toward the hazy horizon as though searching for something only he understood. People were beginning to spill from the saloon behind us, each carrying their own version of the truth. Their whispers gathered like dust devils, circling before settling into poisonous shapes. I heard fragments, cruel, careless fragments. Some insisted I'd begged Thane to win. Others murmured that he'd refused me after earning the right to take me. Lies formed quickly in ridge. They spread faster than brush fire and burned much the same. I felt the town's gaze closing around me again, but Thane's presence held the rising tide at bay. His silence was a shield I had never expected. When my father stumbled out, the crowd parted reluctantly. He looked smaller in the daylight, as though the sun had stripped him down to his consequences. His face crumpled when he saw me, sobriety piercing through the alcohol's haze. He whispered my name, a plea wrapped in regret, but the words sagged under the weight of everything he had broken. Thane stepped back, giving us space, though his watchful stillness remained. My father tried to reach for my hands, but I stepped away, not out of anger but out of exhaustion. He apologized in fragments, promising change he no longer had the strength to deliver. His confession cracked something in both of us. He admitted fear and failure, admitted sorrow for gambling away the last good thing in his life. For the first time, I saw how deeply shame had rooted itself in him. It softened my own anger, though it could not erase anything. For days after the match, I kept to myself. Ridge had opinions to spare, and it fed on scandal like starving wolves. Everywhere I walked, voices dipped, glances sharpened, smiles tightened. Some people me, others enjoyed the spectacle of a woman whose worth had been weighed publicly. Yet in the midst of the cruel attention, small shifts began forming around me. Women who had once watched from porches began greeting me softly. Children approached with hesitant curiosity, sensing my heart had fought a silent war. I spent my mornings helping at the schoolyard, brushing dust from benches and soothing quarrels with gentle firmness. Those tiny acts, so small they nearly vanished, became threads weaving strength back into me. Each day, I felt a little less like a consequence and a little more like myself. Thane's presence lingered around the edges of those days. He never approached me boldly or attempted to steer my path. Instead, he appeared at quiet moments, repairing the saloon roof at dawn, leaving bundles of food in unmarked cloth on our porch, calming a spooked mule near the well. He moved with the humility of someone avoiding gratitude, as though he feared claiming even that. I noticed the rough tenderness in everything he touched. In his hands, even broken things seemed to find dignity. Sometimes he glanced toward me from a distance. Each time I felt a warmth I didn't know how to name. It wasn't desire or charity, it was recognition. The kind that settles into a person slowly, like water smoothing stone. My father, sobered by humiliation, kept mostly to the shadows. He tried to drink less, he tried to speak softer. But regret aged him quickly, and the town's judgment clung to him like rust. One evening, he sat me down and confessed the truth behind his unraveling. Years ago, he had left my mother during a crucial night, chasing a gambling streak he believed would secure our future. She fell ill while he was gone. By the time he returned, she was gone. His grief consumed him, his failure gnawed at him, and he drowned in guilt until he forgot how to rise above it. Hearing it softened the walls around my heart. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness sometimes frees the wounded more than the wrongdoer. The summer days rolled on, their heat singing through the air like a warning. Still, Thane remained a constant presence, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Yet one morning he was simply gone. No boot prints near the saloon, no silhouette along the ridge, no calm voice greeting the horses by the well. Rumors rose immediately. He had ridden north to settle an old dispute, or south to trade cattle, or west to outrun the kind of trouble men carried in their blood. I found myself watching the horizon with unexpected worry. His absence revealed something I had not yet admitted, that his presence had become a thread woven into the fabric of my days, subtle but essential. 3 days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The town hummed with speculation, but beneath their chatter lived a quieter fear, one I felt deep in my ribs. Something had sent Thane away, something heavy enough to silence even him. On the fourth evening, as the sun bled into the dust-laden sky, a rider appeared far down the road. The silhouette wavered in the heat, but the steady posture was unmistakable. Thane was returning, but he rode differently than before, his movements slower, his body leaning as though bearing the weight of a story that would soon collide with mine. Thane's return rode toward ridge like a slow-moving omen, a silhouette slumped in the saddle, dust trailing behind him like a weary veil. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun had reddened into an ember, and its fatting light struck the dried blood at his temple. I stepped forward before I realized I'd moved, my breath tightening as if my ribs had forgotten how to expand. Thane dismounted with effort, boots hitting the ground heavier than they ever had. His eyes lifted to mine, steadfast, bruised, and carrying a sorrow I could feel across the distance. There was no greeting, no explanation, only a quiet apology threaded through the look he gave me, as if he regretted making me wait for his return. But Ridge did not wait long before seizing its moment. Word spread that debts were stirring trouble again, trouble mean enough to take a man's home, a woman's safety, and any scrap of dignity left in a family already battered by gossip. The debt collectors arrived at dusk, their horses stamping impatiently near the saloon, men with hard faces and harder intentions. One of them, Vance, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, a longtime rival of my father, stepped forward and declared the terms. If could not pay by nightfall, he would forfeit whatever he owned, including the saloon, the land beneath it, and anything of value inside. His voice dropped before he added that daughters counted among possessions if a man owed enough. The cruelty of it made my stomach twist. My father protested weakly that he would find the money, though everyone knew he wouldn't. Shame trembled through him, I could see it in the way he clenched his shaking hands against his sides. The crowd gathered quickly, hungry for spectacle. Rumors had made them restless, eager to witness the next downfall. I stood near the porch, heart pounding so loudly my hearing blurred. For the first time, I saw my father shrinking under a weight heavier than liquor. And I realized that if no one intervened, the collectors would drag him, and possibly me, into a future defined by the sort of men. Then Thane stepped between us and the danger. Not with fanfare, not with violence, but with a quiet intensity that froze the air. Even battered from his journey, he held himself like a man carved out of resolve. Vance sneered, asking if Thane meant to interfere. Thane didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me only for a heartbeat, and something in that look steadied him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the street with a weight sharper than steel. He challenged Vance to a single game of chess. One match, if Thane won, the debt would be erased permanently. If he lost, everything he owned, his ranch, his cattle, his future, would be surrendered. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even my father shook his head wildly, urging Thane not to stake his life on a family drowning in disgrace. But Thane's gaze never left Vance. He asked him whether a man so eager to claim what wasn't his had the courage to win something honestly. Vance bristled, his pride too swollen to refuse. He agreed to the match on the condition it be played publicly, on the same saloon table where had made his drunken wager. The symmetry of it struck me like a blow. 2 games, 2 men, 2 moments that could change everything. But this one was not born of desperation or shame. It was a choice, a deliberate act of honor. The table was cleared. Lamps were lit, casting amber glows across the wooden walls. Ridge gathered around with bated breath, forming a living arena for a game that could dismantle or mend what remained of my family's future. My father sat trembling against a post, eyes fixed on the pieces as if they represented the last vestiges of his hope. I stood behind Thane, close enough to see the quiet strength in the line of his shoulders, far enough not to disturb the gravity of what he was about to risk. The game began without ceremony. Vance played with the arrogance of a man who believed power alone secured victory. His moves were sharp, punishing, reckless. Thane countered with patience, shaping the board as if sculpting order from chaos. The room grew hotter, the lamps flickering under the pressure of so many held breaths. Every time my father flinched at a move, every time Vance smirked, every time Thane leaned forward to study the board, I felt something tight inside me. This was not a game, it was a reckoning. An unraveling of past shame and a rewriting of what future might be possible. Halfway through, Vance launched a fierce offensive, cornering Thane's knight and bishop with calculated malice. The crowd murmured, the collectors exchanged satisfied glances. Thane's jaw tightened not in fear but in concentration. His hands remained steady, movements deliberate. He did not rush, he did not break. He sacrificed a piece, then another, drawing the game into a tension so palpable the air seemed to thrum. I felt it in my pulse, in the trembling breath I didn't realize I held. Slowly, a subtle shift emerged. Thane's strategy revealed itself like a rising dawn. His pieces, quiet, disciplined, precise, began to encircle Vance's king. Vance lunged in frustration, miscalculating a critical move. A gasp rose around the room. Thane lifted his rook, studied the board with solemn finality, and set it down in a place that made the entire saloon fall still. Checkmate. The word hung in the air even before Thane spoke it. Vance's face blanched, rage twisting through him as recognition took hold. He had been outplayed publicly, decisively, irrevocably. The match was over. My father's debts were gone. And the shame that had shadowed us for so long loosened its grip for the first time. Vance spat venomous threats, but his agreement bound him, and the whole town bore witness. With bitter curses, he stormed out, his men following with dark glances. Relief swept through Ridge like a sudden breeze. My father collapsed into his hands, sobbing with a grief that finally had room to surface, grief for mistakes, for lost years, for the daughter he had endangered. I knelt beside him, holding him for the first time in longer than I could remember. His apology shook through him like thunder. I forgave him quietly, because forgiveness had become a choice I was finally strong enough to make. When I rose to my feet, Thane was watching me with an expression that unraveled every defense I'd carefully built. He didn't step toward me, he didn't claim victory. Instead, he spoke softly, telling me he had risked everything not to win me but to give me back the freedom my father had nearly taken. He said dignity was not a thing others could hand you, it was something you rebuilt, piece by piece, with every choice to stand again. His words settled into my chest like warm embers. I felt something shift inside me, something tender and frightening. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring about the miracle they'd witnessed. Night deepened, stars appearing one by one above the dusty rooftops. My father slept inside, exhausted. Thane stood at the edge of the porch, preparing to leave, though exhaustion tugged at his battered body. I stepped closer, not knowing what to say, only knowing I needed him to hear something unspoken. He turned toward me, waiting. I told him he hadn't just saved my father, he had saved the part of me I thought the world had broken beyond repair. His breath caught just slightly, as if the truth struck deeper than he expected. He didn't reach for me, he didn't presume anything. He simply said that if I ever chose to walk toward him, not out of obligation, not out of gratitude, but out of my own will, he would be there, not to claim me but to stand beside me. The night held its breath. My heart trembled. And though I moved only one step toward him, that single step felt like the beginning of something vast and unwritten, something that would soon test